I've just started the recording button, Nick.
Oh, perfect. Okay, great. So Greg's got the
Thank
recording
you.
button.
Thank you, Monica.
All right, so some of the stuff we're going to be talking about just is high-level impacts of globalization. And then there'll be a lot of case studies. So we have several, as you've seen in your pack. There must be 5 or 6 case studies. And your assessments, at least all 3 of your assessments will be around case studies. So there's no long format assignments. It's going to be around a business case. And then because we have several people, we actually have different case studies. So approximately half the class on each assignment will be doing one case study and the other half a second one. So that should be, keep it quite interesting for everyone. So this is some stuff directly out of the learning outcomes, fairly administrative, but these are the 5 unit learning outcomes that we're expected to deliver on. Analyzing changes in the global business environment, critically integrate theories and concepts and apply them to the analysis. Well, as I said, with 5 cases, we're certainly going to achieve that. Systematically evaluate innovative responses to the challenges of international business. No problem there. That's towards the end of the course. Innovative criteria and synthesized decision-making strategies appropriate to an international context. So that's 2 things. One of that is implementation, but the other one is actually what are the frameworks that you use to analyze markets. And so we'll be doing that in substantially more detail than before. And then demonstrate the capacity to work collaboratively. Well, 2 of the assignments out of 3 are actually going to be group presentations. So, that's a reasonable assessment of that, but I'm sure that all of you can figure out how to work collaboratively. And if you can't, we've all been through a lot of advanced degrees. You need to fake it well enough for us to not, A, get complaints from your team members, and 2, for you not to, you need to produce good outputs. So I suppose on that note, you are going to be in groups. And, having done a lot of these courses myself, I go, the standard line is, hug each other and do the best. The reality is you need to get a project delivered. And if there are problems with a team member, then you need to, if it is serious enough, then you need to complain, and that's by email. You email myself. And if 2 out of 3 people complain about a team member, then that's something that's going to be problematic for us and therefore problematic for that team member. If one person does, well, then, you're going to have to excuse me, but how are we supposed to know this is not, not my domain to try and sort out squabbles? And I think you all appreciate that. So let's take a practical approach. Certainly we will be. Some graduate attributes: critical and creative thinking, a global perspective, good communication, and good ethics. Of course, all of the material that you submit is passed through some AI-powered software to check that it's not a colleague's piece of submission, and also check that it's not scraped straight off a website. So, just be aware of that. And obviously, how to study the unit. Well, there's going to be a fair amount of theory, and you would have seen some of the readings have got some more conceptual things, and then we really are not going to be covering a lot of very basic models that you might pick up in a bachelor's degree. That's not the goal. And so as you progress through the material, you can always contact myself, to check on things. But effectively, the goal here is that you're able to take on an assignment in your working life that is about where should we expand to, and what are the key things that we need to think about. Obviously, from there on, there's millions and millions of combinations in terms of what you might need to think about or what you might need to consider. But up to that stage, you'll be well prepared. This is perhaps a little bit lofty for me. Okay, contact hours. So we have, you're expected to pre-do some work. Then you've got these workshops, 8 by 3 hours, live online collaborate sessions. And then post-workshop, clearly there's a discussion group. And when curator is up, you'll have a question next to each article, and then people are expected to comment, and the comments are expected to be valid. In other words, as a couple of sentences. There is a textbook which is available online. We'll be covering, I would suggest, pretty much all of the material in the textbook. A lot of it at very high speed in order to focus on some stuff which is not in the textbook, some frameworks that this textbook doesn't utilize, which I think are probably better suited to delivering to executives some sort of useful framework. But it is a nice textbook if you want a really broad overview of global business, and there's almost nothing where that will avoid. On the curator, it does tell you which chapters that we're going to cover, and it is up to you if you want to go through the textbook first or not. But if you certainly are, if the material is sort of a bit overwhelming, then going through the textbook is probably quite useful. We then have some core readings as well as essential readings, of course, and it is required to go through the essential readings and comment on them. The additional readings are for those areas that you're particularly interested in, and then there's a couple of videos in various parts. So this is the kind of schedule that we'll be following. Today is obviously lecture 1, and that covers from the book sections 1, chapter 1, and 4, chapter 11, and there are the topics that we're going to cover. So that's down in this column here, and then obviously in the second half, this is the column that we'll be covering. So these are the kind of frameworks that are kind of much more relevant and novel than perhaps is in the book. The CAGE framework and AAA framework in terms of how do you approach international markets, together with these sorts of assessment frameworks, adding frameworks, why should we get there? And maybe a little more advanced area on what are the preconditions, or what are the kind of thought process that should be going on before international expansion is taken on. And then, as I said, the last 2 modules are an execution-based one. So that is marketing, human resources, and then some fairly granular information on that. 3 assessments, 25, 25, and 50. 2 group presentations, and there's broadly what's expected. So in the first assessment is just some understanding, together with obviously the questions in the case study, of the resource-based framework and VRIO framework in terms of strategy assessment. And as we'll have done this material before you have to submit that, and we're not expecting reams of paper, but some insight into how to use those tools. By the next one, we do those, but then we're talking about what are suggested market entry mechanisms, as well as the adding framework and CAGE framework. And then your obviously your individual submission would have pretty much the whole course. What's useful about having done those group presentations is there's ample opportunity to work with your colleagues and to fill in any gaps that you may have regarding the framework. How should we use it? And I think that will work quite well. So as it relates to that in-class presentation, 2 to 4 students. So we expect you to create groups. 2 to 4 students will present that. The first one is around 12 minutes. So that's over here. And each member is expected to present around about equally. And then what you've got is, these kind of 3 sections to go through. And then there'll be answer time from the class. So we'll probably limit that to probably just 3 or 4 questions, and each person should be prepared to answer one of those questions. And a very similar format is for presentation number 2. So this time we've got another framework, which is the CAGE and the AAA framework. So the whole presentation is a little bit longer, but the same sort of idea. The final project is approximately 3,000 words, and that is really about the case. And you're going to be expected to just use the format as we suggested. The date is on the 24th of April, not the 20th. That date's, just changed. So it is not the 20th, it is the 24th, which is what is up on Curator. And before these slides get loaded up, they will have, the date will reflect the rest of the pack. And as you can see here, some more detailed requirements. So you can use, some additional frameworks like PESTLE, which we're not going to specifically cover in the course. You probably have done it somewhere else, but that's not required. RBV, CAGE, AAA, and really about how does this business do what it needs to do. It's quite an interesting case, but it's not going to be too esoteric. So the cases are sort of tractable. The only thing I think that is really interesting here is that please follow the APA referencing style. So it's just a single style. You can get that off the Murdoch library. I'm sure you're using it in some of the other parts, but it's a neat and easy style, and that's what's expected. Okay, determinant of the final grades, obviously prorated to those marks. So long as there's no issues with complaints about conduct in a group, nor of course, if there's an issue about originality of work. Those two things would negatively skew your mark quite seriously. All right, I think that is around about it on the administrative side. So are there any particular questions, anything novel, not clear?
When will we know our group, Nicholas?
So I'm quite happy if you want to self-sort into groups, but if the preference is that you're randomly allocated into groups, I could have that out tomorrow for you. So I'm not sure if on Zoom, I'm not sure how to conduct a poll, but is there sort of a general preference or not?
We've been happy to self-sort in previous units, so if people are happy to self-sort.
Yep, fine with me. Okay, great. So, group size cannot be more than 4, please. So you're talking about groups of 3, and obviously smaller group sizes help to eliminate some of that, some of the problems of groups anyway. So, quite happy with that. Good. All right. Much more interesting from here on out. All right, so just some interesting things about globalization and or international business. But why we're talking about globalization is I think that is the kind of catch-all for what is international business doing in terms of the overall marketplace and how does it perform. So we see quite a few self-contained national economies with high barriers to trade and investment. And that's been an interesting feature from a historical perspective, probably post-1970s. So if you're looking at sort of the political economy, and we will touch a little bit more on this later, but the post-World War II period was characterized by quite strong Keynesian dominance. So there was a lot of government intervention, there was a lot of protectionism. Famously, Britain sought to take control of the commanding heights of its economy, and that really meant nationalizing a whole lot of industry. And in the 70s, what you had was a lot of inflation and no growth. So you had quite high unemployment and high inflation, and this really led to a big shift in the kind of general decision making about what was possible, what was desirable out of economies. And maybe as a second order effect, that meant that a lot of these decisions were taken away from governments. And that's why you see the independence of a lot of trade bodies, the independence of central banks. So an independent central bank wasn't a feature forever. And I'm not sure that any of you are old enough to have seen that, but the independence of the US central bank was a feature really of around about the late 60s. So Paul Volcker was then an independent central bank. But why I say that is that, remember, economies really, when it's up to politicians, they tend to be quite susceptible to vote movements. And so Keynesian policies and closure of markets would be something that is quite difficult to go back to. And one of the very big structural reasons is the independence of institutions. And what that's led to is integrated economic systems with lower barriers to trade and investment. There's something like over $5 trillion worth of forex exchange daily. and over $18 trillion of goods, $4 trillion of services being sold across borders. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the composition of trade. And obviously, there was also transnational institutions. So we have a more integrated global economic system, and there are a couple of key facets. So one of which is the globalization of markets. The next one is the globalization of production. And the third one is global institutions. This is an interesting diagram of physical goods trade. So you saw there was a statistic there of something like $18 trillion of goods sold. And this is where it really comes from and where it's going to. So as you can see, this is done in shipping containers, TEUs. And you can see the enormous quantity of shipping containers that are moving, let's say, from Asia General. So that's this area. And as you can see, something like 41.5 million containers intra-Asia. And then you've got exports to North America, 18.1 million, plus a further 7 million going to Europe. So this is absolutely the largest by volume. And these are expected to grow by another about 4% per year. So this is still substantially growing, and it is enormous. But there's no doubt that physical goods trade is dominated by Asia and Southeast Asia. So global institutions came about really from post Second World War, and they've evolved over time. But the idea was to manage, regulate, and police global marketplace. And that was to prevent some of the really disastrous things. And we'll touch on that, that happened, let's say, over time. So as the world moves on, there's more and more regulation to try and prevent some of the big problems that have happened. But one of the notable things that these institutions have tried to do is prevent a repeat of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression was founded really of a confluence of a couple of things, but the gold standard together with highly protectionist policies, and between the two, you ended up with extraordinary high levels of unemployment. And the emergence of global institutions, whilst not perfect, has reduced the risk of some of those types of decisions quite substantially. The predecessor to the WTO was GATT. And there's about 98% of world trade is accounted for by this. You have the IMF, the World Bank, and the United Nations. So for those of you who want to debate a bit about the IMF, don't worry, we'll have some time. But it's not now about the IMF and its role in currency crisis, which is quite interesting. Obviously, the Asian financial crisis was a great exemplar of some policies that the IMF had that can go quite badly astray. So yeah, I just wanted to pause and ask, what are the key drivers of globalization? And so this is, I'm asking to you, so you raise your hand, you call something out. But here we're talking about what are the key drivers? Not a trick question, fire away.
Could it be just cost reduction for cheaper labor?
Cool. Cost reduction, yep.
And expansion of the market.
Yep.
Less barriers of entry from investment or trade policies.
Yep.
Technology, I guess.
Technology advancement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tourism.
Tourism, all right. So let's go and put some framework around that. So what we've got here is cost reductions and expansion. Now that would be classified as the kind of microeconomics of it. Why do companies try and go other places? Where the two features, have been a reduction of trade barriers, which are under politics, and improvements in technology. And so the reason that more trade is more possible nowadays is probably inside those two reasons. And then those cost reduction and expansion are some of the key frameworks of why do businesses bother with this. As we said, so you've got those barriers, and then I've put here quite clumsily a centralization of general economic philosophy. So as I said, you've got this great movement, this mega trend over 70 years away from kind of the more what used to be leftist policies to these kind of centrist trade and the separation of institutions. And then technological change, which is really payment and logistics. So, without the technological change, it's very, very difficult to coordinate these diverse supply chains. And it's also very difficult to assure yourself of payment. And that's not to say that there wasn't globalization before this happened, but there's real limits to how much you could do before we had these two features. And here's a kind of table. This is from the book of what that looks like. And as you can see, somewhere around 1913, so this is just prior to World War I, you've got relatively high tariff levels. And as you can see from already 1990 and by 2010, you've got substantially low tariff levels, if not irrelevant tariff levels. And this is one of the big drivers, right? Even if you were aiming to internationalize in previous periods, there was a substantial disadvantage. Some of you may recall, it was a real thing before 1990 that when you went to other countries, a duty-free shop could offer very different pricing. And nowadays, if you travel enough, it's really quite unusual, and you're looking for sort of some small tax differences. But there certainly was a period where this was the great thing. Whenever you went somewhere, people would give you a shopping list because there was such big duties that wherever you flew, you could you could buy things and deliver them a lot cheaper than what they were available at home. The second thing to note here is that how homogeneous this has become. So not only are the levels lower, but they're very, very similar across markets.
Nick, sorry, question. Who sets that?
So let's take an example of NAFTA. In NAFTA, that's the North American Free Trade Agreement. That's Canada, United States, and Mexico. They will agree on a set of tariffs, which obviously is subject to intense lobbying. So you'll have farmers lobbying for this, you'll have automakers lobbying for that. So it's quite a detailed thing. The TPP, which has just been launched, it's got a new name, had a very similar process. So inside of those, the group of countries will agree on a set of tariffs.
Okay.
If you do not have a trade agreement, you fall under the World Trade Organization tariffs, which are somewhere around 15%. They also differ. So the challenge for Britain, as it's left the European Union, where it used to have zeros, is it's now, it's currently in an extended period, but it's going to have to renegotiate. Otherwise, it falls under the kind of WTO, which says that tariffs shouldn't be more than 10 to 15%.
Okay, thank you.
And I think that automotive tends to be higher. This is obviously a blended average, but you do have quite substantial variation across products for quite a few reasons. So that's that lowering of barriers that we spoke about. And now you're at a technological change. And clearly this idea of being able to take orders, process orders, Amazon wouldn't have existed in an era where you didn't have microprocessors and the internet. This has been fundamental to the ability to produce globalization. And here we have some other statistics about how the world output's changed. So it's tempting to think of globalization as being dominated by the existing powers, but the reality is it does improve the competition, or the competition in every market. And so whilst we'll talk about it in more detail later, this does lead to actual reductions in your major powers' export and share of global GDP. So in the 60s, the US accounted for something like 38% of global output. And by 2012, you're looking at about 23%. So that is down nearly a third. And that's quite natural. That's, their economy has continued to grow, but the rest of the world's economy keeps growing faster. And also by having these distributed value chains, you're actually moving a lot of that production all over the world, and it's a bit of a false dream that you could have internalized it all inside a country, despite what Donald Trump, would like to believe. Nonetheless, globalization, broadly speaking, has allowed a lot more countries to perform a lot better than what they would have done alone. Here you can see just what that looks like, and you can see this kind of 1/3 reduction by the developed, so-called developed economies, over that 60-year period. So one of the things that makes that possible to happen is foreign direct investment. So, FDI is really investment that travels straight into countries, but is quite separate to investment capital or portfolio capital. And so these flows rise. The biggest recipients are China, Brazil, Mexico, China, as well as United States. And this is what broadly that looks like. So as you can see, at one stage, the United States completely dominated where anybody would invest any money. But that really has reduced, and you've got this idea that a lot more foreign direct investment proportionally will go to developing economies. What we've covered so far is this idea that part of the reason globalization can occur is technology improves and barriers reduce. But you also have this, as I said, this tend towards the center of economic policy. And so in 1980, you may have had a lot of small economies that were completely closed because they believed they could do that better themselves. And as economies migrate to kind of a more open model, you do tend to get FDI flowing to them. And FDI is quite big, but one of the interesting questions is what proportion of investment does FDI account for? That's a question for you guys. Like, we look at these numbers, and you can draw the line here, and you're saying, wow, that's a big number. That's like $1.5 trillion in total. But what does that mean? Is that 50% of global investment? Is that 80%? Is it 20%? Like, what's the sort of estimate? Nobody?
I think it must be less than 10%.
Yeah, and that's right. So despite all of the hype about globalization, FDI flows account for around about 10, just under 10, but near 10% of fixed investment in countries. And so whilst these numbers seem enormous, it's easy to kind of imagine the world as perfectly flat, perfectly tradable, but actually there's substantial differences. And so Jiyoung is right, 10%. So there's still substantial scope for improvements. We're going to talk about why it is only 10%, and that's probably the more central part of this course is, what holds that number down. All right, so on to some ideas of impact. So, now we're going to just discuss a little bit more about impacts of FDI. And so if I can perhaps stop share for a second. All right, so I'm not sure if, let's talk about impact of foreign direct investment. So good and bad. Should I ask, does somebody want to volunteer?
Yeah, so yep. I think the investors like the perspective, they can get, for example, like, let's say a US organization made FDI in China, and they will get cheaper labor, and then so as a result they will get a bigger margin bigger margin at the end. But in the, I mean, what is the downside is that basically our US market will lose, I mean, chance, kind of like the chance of employment as well. I think that is a downside. So that's why Donald Trump tried to bring in all the like the US organization who had the FDI in overseas by reducing the company tax, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, Donald Trump, quite famously said that Apple is going to relocate their supply chains to the United States. And so, yeah, so FDI offers companies that ability to export some part of their manufacturing or service production. And that offers why does the company do that? Because they clearly see some benefit that they can reduce their cost. It can move jobs offshore. So if you're a recipient of FDI, that can mean more jobs for you, right? I mean, so that's a pro and a con, right? It depends which direction the FDI is flowing. And so you're right. So that's termed the arbitrage of an input. So, I simply look for a lower cost location, cheaper labor maybe. And Apple's an interesting example, but what sort of industry would be most interested in, pure labor arbitrage? I mean, any ideas of what industry is right up there? And it wouldn't be Apple, because that's quite a complex input, but what sort of industry do you think would be most keen on cheap labor?
Would it be construction?
It's difficult to transport construction, right? So you're right, but that might be shipbuilding, but general construction is not really tradable.
Manufacturing company, so
yeah,
like
manufacturing.
automotive.
So, all right, so automotive. Plus minus. So I'll tell you an interesting thing about automotive in terms of cheapest labor. So one of the bigger drivers of automotive is actually tariffs. In South Africa, which is a small market, total purchases of automotive is about 600,000 units per year. And that's globally quite small. Yeah? United States is 12 million. China is like 16 million vehicles a year. So 600,000 small numbers. And there are 7 motor manufacturing plants in South Africa, but they're not there because of labor. As an example, the Mercedes-Benz plant, which produces about 70,000 vehicles per year, clearly they're not sold in South Africa in that volume. But the employment level there is probably 500 people. And so you go, well, that seems really small. And the reality is the capital to employment ratio is enormous. And so what you're looking for is some sort of industry where your capital ratio is going to be much lower than auto. But you're absolutely right. Manufacturing is key in the tradable sector. And the other feature of vehicles, what is it that assists manufacturing? What's an actual physical attribute? Why would you trade vehicles as opposed to toilet paper? I hope none of you have watched the video, but there's a short 5-minute clip somewhere in your pack. But why is toilet paper produced locally? Wherever you are in the world, it doesn't matter. Well, it's light and it's cheap, but it's quite big. So, this
because of like the supply chain cost.
No, it's simply because I get very little value for quite a large volume. And so shipping it around the world is not particularly attractive. So what you find is that automotive is strongly traded because intuitively you understand it's a very expensive product. You can add a lot of value and you can ship it, and I get a lot of value shipped. So that's an important thing too. When you look at global trade flows, you go, is this going to be traded? And like we're saying, Paul, that's why construction is difficult to trade. Probably the most.
What about pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, so pharmaceutical is heavily traded, and the value there is actually the R&D. So you have very high levels of pharmaceutical trading, highly concentrated as well. So you have a big concentration of that Europe, India, and that's because your R&D input is huge. And you have a quite high value small product. But it's important. One of the key things about trade is when you look at trade flows and when you look at your own company, it's about, well, hold on, does this make sense? What's important here is that you got some of this knowledge you'll have intuitively about your own products. So you might say, no, I know this product and we're definitely going to export it or ship it or not. But what you're doing through this course is trying to understand, well why? What am I fundamentally appreciating about this product versus other products? Okay, so the industry that I think is archetypal of labor arbitrage is textiles. And so what you find is textiles really move with labor. And so you had textile industry being quite dominant in small areas like, in Mauritius for a while. Then you had Southeast Asia. Then you had China with a very big textile industry. India has a textile industry. And those are interestingly being undercut, by now like Bangladesh, because there you can, your occupational health and safety is lower and your cost of labor is lower. And that works because that product has very little capital for a lot of labor. And so probably your archetypal labor input is textiles. All right, great. So that was Ji-Young's sort of FTI. There's some arbitrage of inputs, some job movement, and we'll come back to some more impacts. But what else? What does FDI do in terms of your domestic market?
Creating more jobs.
Yep, sure. So we've got the jobs.
Okay.
There are tax rebates or a tax benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's often very substantial benefits. And I want to imagine if we said that the job benefit of Mercedes-Benz in a country like South Africa is 500 jobs, right? It's sort of irrelevant. Why does the government subsidize that plant more than the total salary bill of the plant? Right? So think of that. Like you go, if it was purely a jobs play, it's much cheaper for the government just to pay all those people. Yeah. So stay at home, here's the money, and they would save a lot of money as a government.
I'm thinking maybe it benefits the country in terms of the technology building. So they learn that means they put themselves as the country that builds to learn a new technology or manufacturing advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the very big things that there is with manufacturing is what's called technology transfer. So quite unlike services, if I take a manufacturing plant of automotive and I take it from Germany and I let Mercedes-Benz put it in South Africa, you get very similar productivity levels, excepting where you've got strict government regulation about how to produce cars, right? So if governments stay out of the way, your productivity level rapidly approaches, one global international standard. One of the mechanisms that is happening by, as Cindy points out, is you have technology transfer. Now, from an economics term, we're going to cover this again, don't worry, in a few more slides, but there's three types of things you can do. You can have process technology, you can have equipment technology, and you can have know-how technology. So process technology is the stuff you write down in your manuals. Tighten bolt, 3.6 Newton meters of torque, clip this onto there, whichever. But this is transferable, right? You send the documents to wherever. Equipment, transferable, send the documents. Know-how is actually quite difficult. And so there's a couple of reasons, and we're going to come back to this key question. But why is it so much more difficult for service companies to export? Why is productivity in services very, very different across markets? And at least part of that answer, and you need to sort of jotting down this big question for you as you tomorrow morning you wake up and you go, I wonder why I don't see a lot of American banks or Chinese banks or whatever, is why not? Right? I mean, we see the same cars pretty much in any country you go to, you'll see largely the same brands.
I think the service is, the service is delivered by intangible asset, and intangible asset is developed and comprised of culture and behaviors in that, in that country where the company is headquartered. So, for example, I cannot expect to have a Japanese style service in Singapore because Japanese style service that is really like the anchored and rooted in Japanese culture. That is my answer, but I may not.
Look, it's certainly part of the answer, right? There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's some useful points in there. So perhaps we're going to come to a framework you've seen called the CAGE framework. And this specifically deals with some of these what's called bilateral country differences. So how distinct are Singaporean people from Japanese people? But you're going to find through this course, and I quite gleefully do this, right? That I'm going to push you to debate on the culture question. I'm quite comfortable that you can establish a corporate culture. I am comfortable that some countries like Japan, where you have very homogeneous populations and sort of very, very distinct, habits, and they're also considered quite tight, that you can really have quite distinct cultures. But I'm going to ask you to be fairly specific and careful when we talk about culture through this course, and it's in terms of academic rigor, because you're going to find that it's quite difficult to put much on that. One of the things that is interesting, Jung, is this idea of Japanese culture and Toyota's manufacturing plants. And not in this course, but in another course, we're going to look at the NMMI plant, which is a motor plant that Toyota produced in the United States. And that plant outperformed American plants, right? This is done in the 80s. It's a real plant, wasn't an experiment.
Yeah, so I agree with you.
It's possible, but there's probably some more fundamental reasons why not just Japanese companies, but services are much more difficult to move globally. And that's not just Japanese services, right? I'm quite happy that most services, you don't see regional hegemony of banking particularly as a good example. And there's some other reasons, right? But we'll get to that. But I'm encouraging you to jot this down.
Maybe because of I think the May mentioned, like because of regulations.
Yeah, well, that is a great point. So there's no doubt regulations in particularly banking, huge impact, hugely impactful. So we're going to come to this because we're going to make a more generalizable model. Anybody else? FDI benefits or problems in the market that FDI is aimed at?
This might be a negative one and probably a bit too far-reaching, but the political sway it has as well. So I'm thinking of Chinese FDI in Sri Lanka, for example. Their sort of influence in building a port, which is essential to stabilize, the Sri Lankan economy, also has them beholden to Chinese interests as well.
Yeah, that's right. So this Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is a little bit unusual in the business world. It's, I would suggest, widely thought of as inappropriately cheap loans, which don't make commercial sense, and sort of this not clear reason why you would invest so much in so many places if it isn't a pure play, sort of influence into those markets. FDI, when state directed, can sometimes come with a lot of strings attached. So state directed FDI, absolutely, politics thing. All right, I'm going to talk about, so maybe it touches on Cindy's just as an assist here, but the concept that when you have FDI, what you have is higher levels of competition in your local market. All right, so when you have FDI, it increases the competition in your market. And we can take a number of examples for that, but let's imagine that you as a multinational, and you're Apple, just because it's well known, you're Apple, and you say you want some sort of electronic componentry produced in China. Now, the reality is that you're going to do some vendor selection, we're going to talk about how, but the point is you'll find a vendor. You'll be happy with a vendor there. You're going to have quality levels. You're going to be pushing for those quality levels. And that vendor is then going to compete in its domestic market more effectively. And what you find is that is very, very beneficial, interestingly, for local markets. And I would suggest that that's also somewhat of a double-edged sword, because that can sometimes displace local firms, right? If you go and build something in a market that's opened up, the more FDI there is, the more globalized product quality level becomes. And I think that you find that, you know, and I talk a lot about motor because I've spent a long time in motor, but also because it's a complex value chain. And what you would have found in China around 2000, when the first sort of rush started about vehicles, is the quality levels were absolutely atrocious. You know, and I think that that's a fair comment. And you had all these JVs set up, VW being one of the earliest ones, you know, but Chevrolet as well. And today you've got quality levels that are reasonable or global standard in many cases. Another great example of this is the Hindustan vehicle in India. So this was part of a key, you know, sort of group of policies, but this was nationalized and the quality was terrible. And what you found as soon as you allowed imports is that disappeared from the market. So if you are in a factory producing poor quality, FDI will change your world. You know, and there's no neat way of saying that. Is that a bad thing? Arguably, no. But if you're an employee in that factory, it's not a wonderful thing. You know, and I suppose the other great example of that is the Trabant, which was an East German vehicle. All right, so FDI is big news for a country. One is you can't withdraw it quickly. So much of the criticism you hear about globalization relates to what's called portfolio investment capital. So Stiglitz dislikes globalization sort of quite generally, makes a nice point, does nice videos, but he's very concerned with portfolio flows. FDI flows are quite stable. Once you've bought and paid for a plant, it's actually reasonably difficult to extract yourself from that. You know, I mean, you know, it goes without saying. FDI rapidly increases the competition in the market, and it also it's a very substantial technology transfer. So FDI is broadly positive for the place that it gets located in. And there are some caveats, we're going to come back to this, where FDI isn't, there are some limits to that. Okay, so let's spend some time just looking at what the composition is and what the intensity, so what gets traded across the world. So this is a slide which perhaps is underappreciated. Over here we have, sorry. This is goods trading across the world. So if you recall the slide, the map for the TEUs, that's goods. So 13 trillion roughly as 2017 dollars. You know, so it depends on if you're using, you know, which currency and so on. So don't worry that the 13 isn't the same as the 18 trillion in the previous slide. But what this slide's point is that you have a very similar amount of trade, which is in services. And you may recall that the previous slide had 18 and 4. And here you have a figure of 5 trillion services. But one of the things that McKinsey, you know, tends to point out, and this data is sourced from them, is that you have very high levels of services embedded in goods. And what that is a warranty which resides in the manufacturing country. So this talks about the value of, this is the thing that you sell, right? No problem, easy concept. Here is the service, right? This is banking. But over here you've got, well, I added this much warranty. Here is my technology transfers and patents. And this is kind of, you know, YouTube, Facebook, that sort of stuff. The point that this slide makes is that it is a mistake to consider trade to be something that is about physical goods only. Trade is something that occurs very substantially around services. And when you have a look at what that means, both in terms of countries, and when you have a look at what that means in terms of what your product offering may be, that's important. So yeah, some implications of this. So this has been in the news, right? Maybe not listed services trade. But what's kind of one of the biggest challenges with services trade from a government perspective? But you can list any challenge you want. Take a bash. Nobody's been wrong yet, right? Must be a very bright class. Give it a whirl.
The service can be changeable.
Yep.
I mean, scope of the service. So it is very difficult to put the tax on or like a
that's exactly it, right? Valuation is tricky. So this leads to much more arbitrage than physical goods, right? Because if you value something and you're moving a physical good, that's one type of charge. Whereas a service is both much more difficult for a revenue office to monitor, and the transfer pricing is much more complex to understand. This year, you may have seen Google and the government of Australia had a disagreement about whether or not they should pay some sort of fee to domestic news providers. And whatever your opinion of the whys of that, the challenge for Google globally is that you have a situation where their revenue in Australia was approximately $5.2 billion, which was about 12 or 15% of global revenue. And out of that, their tax bill in Australia was around $100 million. Now, when you say that that's 15% of their global revenue, Google also loses a lot of money on this product called Google Drive, which is not was unaffected by this decision. So they lose around $2 billion a year on Google Drive. What that leaves you with is non-Google Drive Google has 15% based out of Australia and makes several $billion a year and pays $100 million tax. And so governments go, well, does that feel right? We don't know if that's right. And I'm not attacking Google. Like, I mean, this is a problem that governments will solve. But the issue here becomes, how do you value what is the transfer price? So it's much more tractable to say, okay, a vehicle is moving across border, a computer is moving across a border. But when you say that it's a service and it's an intangible, you get substantial issues, and this does lead to some dramatic issues. All right, so here's just some interesting statistics around what intangibles and how important they are. They're an increasingly important part of the value chains, as we said. Capitalized spending on intangibles is high. This is the change. So here you've got change in spending, and as you can see, here is pharma and medical devices. We spoke about that a little bit earlier, and so this idea of the intangible component is bigger and bigger, and that leads to some issue of, well, who actually pays the tax on that? And this is an important point globally. There's a couple of other points that we can make about it. When knowledge and intangibles are this big, it is more difficult for new entrants to absorb a lot of labor. So this is an important comment. One of the ways that many economies move from agrarian or agriculture-based economies to modern economies is you move people off farms where they traditionally earned a few dollars a day, and you put them in factories. And you could do that en masse. But as you spend more and more and more on R&D, you have fewer and fewer job opportunities at these very low skill levels. And so when I say this is a problem, it is what it is, but it does do that. Number two, this undermines some of the myth about trade and job losses, because you really have very high levels of investment in more and more complex technology. So is it trade that is leading to job losses, or is it the fact that it is difficult to absorb this much labor in more and more complex products and more capital intensive products? So if you want to, and this is, if you're interested, this is Dani Roderick's kind of main theory or concern, is that as you make things more and more complex, it's more and more difficult for you to industrialize a country in a way that absorbs tens or hundreds of thousands of people into industry. Nonetheless, it's a core part of globalization, and as you can see, R&D is an enormous part of much of this. Globally innovated sectors of the economy have very high levels of growth. You can see this is chemicals, electronics, cars, pharmaceuticals. You've got those regional processed goods. So if you recall, we said that some goods are not particularly useful to do globally. So this is what's called regionally processed. So you've got paper, including toilet paper, plastics, food and beverage, where it's very difficult. And then really you've got your lowest level of R&D occurring over here in this section here around healthcare and transport services, which is part of this question of why are services difficult to trade, because it's difficult to actually get a productivity advantage. It's another piece of it. So now just looking at trade intensity and inputs. So we asked the question, FDI accounts for how much investment? And Jiung said less than 10%, which is about right. So here is global exports as a percentage of GDP. And what's important to note here is this level is somewhere around 20%. So around about 1/5 globally. You can see this really sharp increase that occurred from the mid-90s up to 2005, coincided with China's accession to the World Trade Organization, fairly flat thereafter. Any ideas of why it's flat thereafter? I mean, I showed you a slide which had the world, and it showed growth in how much stuff was being shipped. So why is this now flat here?
Nick, it's just Monica, and I'm just having a stab in the dark. Is it due to the capacity of shipping then?
No, so you're right, shipping capacity keeps going up.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying to you is you can believe that the amount of stuff being shipped, say for COVID, obviously that's going to be a fun graph, there's going to be this huge collapse, but say for COVID, it's kind of been flat since somewhere around 2010 as a percent of GDP.
Is it because of the tariff become flat, and also government would like to protect their domestic economy situations?
Yep, so maybe, right, we would expect that maybe to be right at the edge here, Donald Trump, but it's pretty flattish from, let's say, 2010, where everyone was still in harmony and peace. So you're right, that's certainly going to dip some of the trade numbers. On tariffs, like you've got Australia and China, having this bizarre spat, so that will cause a dip, certainly. Well, one of the big things here is that the Chinese GDP is growing so well. So even in absolute dollars, the exports are growing. As a percentage of GDP, it's quite flat. And that economy, the second biggest economy in the world, is now big enough for it to probably be the single biggest reason. But the other two reasons are quite right. You've got ideas of some slowdown, governments saying, okay, cool, we'd like some of this to be domesticated, and you've got some features around shipping capacity, but you've also got big growth in that economy. And that carries over to this graph.
It's Monica. And excuse my ignorance, if we go back to that slide, if there's if there's an increase in like more development countries, will that at some point go up again, or will that still continue to drop? I'm just trying to get it clear in my head.
So I suppose what I'm saying is absolute dollar value and containerage is increasing.
Yeah.
But it's only increasing now at the speed of GDP growth.
Yeah.
So what could cause this to become higher and higher as a percentage of GDP? Well, I think that in some countries you may be near some sort of level where you've got political problems, which we've just mentioned. So can the United States really import much more? Well, we'll see in the next slide that there is scope for it. But they have to re-export the stuff, because even the United States, there's a finite amount of stuff you can import if you don't sell it again. So as world GDP grows, this is probably likely to remain reasonably flat.
Yeah. Okay.
Although that's not because of any reason, except you need to be able to export to each other. And the world's second largest economy isn't a massive fan of imports. And that's kind of some sort of limit to what this can do.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. Yeah.
Yep. So your world's largest economy, United States, happy with imports, as we all know. China, not so keen. European Union, fine with imports. So if you really wanted to shift the needle on this, you're probably going to need China to allow more imports before global exports could really keep going.
Sorry, thank you.
No worries. Okay, so here is a kind of interesting and similar concept. And remember, don't worry, for those of you who are thinking, I didn't sign up for an economics course, it's we do get more and more focused on business. But as we said, we're going to start off just thinking about the picture of globalization. So here is trade intensity. And this is exports as a share of output. And as you can see, although the global average is going to sit around 20%, that does differ. So here you can see the impact of, a very buoyant domestic economy in China. So we're producing a lot of stuff, but now we're using it ourselves. Right? Here you can see countries that the domestic market doesn't grow as much. And so part of this, for your economics, those people are interested, a lot of debt-fueled demand growth, a lot of transition from the Chinese central idea that this is going to, what they need to do is consume more, because otherwise you kind of run out of places to sell it. And then you've got things like United States sitting pretty flat, and really Europe being powered along by Germany. Now here was, Monica, why the answer to you wasn't so clean and yes or no. Because intermediate inputs as a share of total outputs is quite high. So a lot of the stuff you export gets used in something else. So those people who are really, oh my goodness, why are we importing stuff? Well, if you're Europe, you're importing things because you largely package it and sell it again, right? Not entirely, but I'm saying it's a big chunk of what you do. A lot of your imports serve to export. So how does Europe import more? Well, it's not really better pricing, is it? It's the ability to export, and this is the fundamental idea of trade. And then you've got you've got a very similar pattern here, looking at, well, if the Chinese economy is consuming more, then the intermediate imports have slowed. And here you have a kind of very stable picture about other countries. So this section here talks about increasing diversity in that economy. It can produce more of its own stuff. And as I said, maybe a bit of a reluctance to import much, which would lead to difficult to export global trade. All right, and here you see, and I'm going to keep this one quick because it's kind of the same idea, but you see the point being that you really have a nice correlation where if you import a lot of stuff, you tend to export it. So computers and electronics, if you have a big computers and electronics industry, you are going to import quite a lot of stuff. But the good news is you're going to export quite a lot of stuff. So this is not a single line, oh my goodness, let's pick an industry and we'll only export forever. Global trade, and we're going to talk about globalization further, but it's important to keep these ideas in mind, whether you're at dinner, impressing your friends, this sort of stuff does come up, going, well, isn't this like a one-way thing? And this is perhaps one of the more technically orientated arguments about protectionism. We've covered this and we've had a look at. So as I said, China's growth, and this is just the number. You've seen China move from $1.2 trillion economy size, which was 6th in 2000, to about 14 trillion in 2019. So that's a 12-fold growth. The United States, for comparison, 20 trillion in the same period has grown 2 times. It's quite easy to see that even if you're exporting more and more every year, with an economy that's growing that fast, it's not going to, your percentage exports should decline. All right. So the world is not flat and there is missing trade. So we spoke a little bit about FDI, and we talk about trade as occurring at the firm level. And we've already made some comments about this. Trade occurs in an environment created by governments and by regulation, but the actual decision occurs at the level of the firm, right? So countries don't need trade, firms do. So we're going to ask you, so we'd like some estimates, please. So the first one we're going to estimate, what proportion of telephone calls are made across borders? Take a flyer, like, what's riding on this question, right? Very little.
40%.
40%. Okay, somebody else.
20%.
Okay, anybody else with a bet? How integrated is the world?
So you're referring to current situation, right? The current, how many % of the phone calls?
I'm sorry?
Are you referring to now, as in now, how many % of the phone calls?
No, 2010, so.
Oh, 2010. 2010
pick a number.
Maybe 80%?
80%, okay, cool. That's the number.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Wow, much higher.
So and don't worry, because when you survey readers of Harvard Business Review, they agree with your estimates. So this is a question of, when you read the popular media, you go, oh my goodness, the world's flat. We're about to be either invaded or overtaken by imports or exports or some crazy stuff, right? But it's just not true. Immigrants to population. So I'm not going to labor the point, but anybody just call out a reasonable estimate?
%25.
25%, not bad. In Australia, it is actually 23%, but globally, it is much, much lower. In the United States, with Donald Trump or anybody else at the helm, you're actually at 12%. And obviously, this super low number includes very homogenous societies, where you would have much lower numbers, Japan, China, where, you'd have extremely low levels. But there's a sense, right? A foreign direct investment, as we said, around about 10%. Equity investment, this is portfolio capital, bonds, stocks, currency.
I think around 40%.
40%?
Not bad, around 20. And lastly, exports to GDP, we've just seen somewhere around 25%. So if you are placing 10% of your phone calls internationally, you are part of a very exclusive club. If you read HBR, this is what your estimates look like. So as I said, very similar to what you guys, perhaps you subscribe. But I suppose the point that we make here is that international business is tricky. And that's why firms don't do this all the time. Only the first two are perhaps comments about people. And perhaps that drives why the other measures are also slow. So this is Kemawat, and we're gonna use some of his frameworks later. So Canadian states trade 5 times more with each other than they do with United States states. They're separated by a peaceful border, effectively no tariffs, it's common language. They trade with each other 5 times more. And this is an interesting problem, and that's what it's called, missing trade. If you share a border, you are 125% more likely to trade than if you don't share a border. If you share a currency, 114%. If you share a single language, you're 42% more likely to trade. And interestingly, if you share a colonial past, you are 188% more likely to trade with each other. So why do we even cover this sort of stuff? Well, part of the framework that we're going to look at is one that talks about what are the differences that make it difficult or easy for business. And so if you imagine that the world is reasonably efficient, you look at these numbers and you say, well, there's got to be some realistic reason that this occurs. I mean, it's not that all businesses have just, they don't feel like competing or something like that. But the reality is we're going to go through that. And Ji-Young brought it up and said there's a cultural dimension to many of these decisions. And so things like shared colonial past can bridge a lot of those gaps. Sometimes they make them bigger. I would suggest South Korea and Japan do not enjoy their colonial history, but there are a large number of countries which, by the simple fact that, for example, you were colonized by Portugal or England, you'll trade with another country that is colonized by the same place. So we're somewhere probably 3/4, so I don't know if we should take a break for about 5 minutes. We'll talk a little bit about multinationals, and then we're actually going to discuss multinationals because people tend to like them or dislike them in varying degrees. And then we're going to just have a look a little bit about globalization, some of the more sort of evidence-based impacts it has on countries. So if you don't mind, we're going to do 5 clock minutes, and else the bathroom breaks or whatever else you know. Grant, so let me it's not going to work, is it? That's working. All right. Screen. Right, the multinational. So we're actually going to break out into groups in just a minute, and we're going to automatically allocate you to some groups. just to talk about some multinationals. But obviously, a multinational is any business that has some productive capacities in other markets. There's obviously been a rise in non-US multinationals that follows the trade flows that we've just been talking about. Also some mini multinationals. And some small and medium firms have been able to expand internationally, and that follows the same reasons. It's lower regulation, and you've got a great amount of technology which allows this to happen a bit more easily. And so what's happened with multinationals is, as you can see, economies have become more diverse, and so you get from a situation where you've got very, very high levels of multinationals to much smaller, and then other markets have multinational firms as well. So one of the questions we're going to do now, and you're just going to break out into small groups, and it's going to take us about just less than 5 minutes, is some pros and cons of multinationals. So this builds on some of the questions that we've already discussed. Why are things traded? But there's also some unique insights that I'm sure you can consider in terms of large firms. Multinationals make up 1% of firms in the United States. And some specific questions I would like you to estimate are things like what proportion of wages do they pay? Do they account for much productivity growth, research and development? What do they do that is not positive? So if we could do that, and Greg, will you create those rooms? Is everyone back? Okay, so from each group, have you got a spokesperson?
Hello, I'm happy to start from Joyce, Sanjay, and myself.
Great, let's do it. Pros and cons.
I suppose, so we spent a bit more time maybe on the pros, but we looked at the development of moving into new market territories and how you can expand there. We looked at how you can employ locally in terms of having better local knowledge and understanding the culture of the country that you're moving to operate in.
Yep.
We looked at cost reduction around control over supply chains or warehousing, and how that might even move into a more operational space of like better control over your day-to-day operations, so you can problem solve and react quicker to the environments that you have. One of the things we started to look around wages was maybe a con, like would an organization have the right benefits in place in terms of wages and fair wages, and what does that mean in terms of if you're in the US or you're in India, are the wage systems correct and equal in terms of the context of each of those places, and whether there's disparity there.
Yep.
We touched briefly on We went off a little bit of a tangent, yeah, but we touched briefly on around consultancy services and firms as well, and kind of how multinationals maybe struggle to control intellectual property, and then that's where you might start to see issues with how they can hire locally, and then how then they transport people and employees from countries to go and set up base in new countries, and whether that can be have a negative impact long term. But is it there as a way of protecting certain intellectual property and intangible?
Yep.
Yeah, I think that was our.
Cool. Nice one. I'm just going to collect all these, then we can talk about some of the common themes.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Right, who's next? All right.
I'm happy
yep.
to go, Nicholas. Sorry, yes.
Fantastic.
I've got a few sort of similar things from our group. So the pros is obviously they create consistent experiences for consumers.
Yep.
Can enforce minimum quality standards, create jobs, inspire innovation, and fuel cultural and ethnic awareness from a pros point of view. And May can elaborate a little bit to the cons. May, if you want to chip in with the cons.
Let me just unmute. So for the cons itself, maybe there are environmental cons when you move this, outsource the production to developing economies, right? Maybe the environment factors may be a disadvantage. Some of the profit may not be really, since you're investing overseas, you're not getting the profit within your own country. That's one of the profit repatriation. Skilled labor, maybe when you are hiring MNC, you don't get your own people. You may have to hire some skilled labor for other countries or economy. So maybe the best jobs may not be received by the local, but in fact, you have to pay up someone outside your country.
You mean outside the foreign country where you're investing?
Yep.
Cool, thank you.
I can go next. My team is Leon and Okayao. We had 3 points on pros, very similar to what Paul has on job creation. We think that another pro is the foreign taxes into the country. And the third point is global benefits to the employees who are hired in an M&E. The cons would be that then you create labor competition to local firms. Number 2, loss of local essence. And thirdly, clash in culture and fairness within the country. So these are the few points that we have within the team.
What was the clash one? Just explain that a little bit for everyone.
Clash in culture, where, if you have a company, say, from the US coming into China, China could have their own culture differences in comparison to a Asian culture versus Western culture. That could be a clash.
You mean between staff or on the product level?
Between staff, employee.
Maybe I add on a little bit. It's like working behavior as well. So let's say, for example, moving factories from China to India, let's say for the iPhone. The workers between the two group of race may be different. The Chinese way of working and the Indian ways of working. So there'll be kind of challenges like this.
All right, perfect. So you're putting that under the same points, the clashing sort of work culture?
It's under the cons.
Yep. Perfect. That it. I think there might have been a 4th group. No? Yes.
I will go.
Are we the 4th group?
Perfect. Good.
No, William, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So for the advantage wise, generating wealth and also they can also spread ideas and cultures, whatever the previous culture that they have, they can also spread the cultures to the new countries that they are going and stuff. For the disadvantages, I saw this particular point that they can manipulate their taxes in different countries to save their money and costs. Yep.
Okay.
I also saw other like advantages because of a multinational enterprise. They can move around the talents from global. Like they have some excellent engineer from US, they can move them to Japan or to China. So bring the knowledge and technology around the world and spread the knowledge. And also they are able to, the disadvantage will be influence the culture and the politics, like Uber. When Uber enter into market into China or Hong Kong, they can bring influence to the culture and also the politics as well, like the law or regulations.
Yeah.
Yep.
Environment. Okay, cool. So what we've got is a couple of maybe big headings. So let's just think about maybe groups of those comments. So we had a group of comments which were on the motivation of firms, and they are in cost reduction, expanded markets, the ability to move talent. So I think I have this advantage. Where I think I have a better product. So maybe that's under expanded market as well. We've got some ideas under the country. So the country receives better quality goods, right? There might be some minimum quality. Maybe as a country, I receive more jobs, but maybe we'll put that under labor. There's some innovations. Maybe I get some more tax. Maybe there's environment. Maybe I don't feel I'm getting my share of the tax. So that's under country. And then we've got labor, which we've raised a couple of points around. One of them, which we're going to deal with quite specifically, is expatriates. How many expatriates do I send out? What's the right number? Is there a number that's too many? Perhaps global companies offer benefits which are better, and maybe there's more jobs. And we've got this issue in labor is also about how do they get managed. And I suppose one of the interesting, there's a film, I think it's on Netflix, called American Factory. I don't know how many people, anybody seen that, American Factory? Well, it's an interesting film. Just as a sidebar, one of the trivia, it was funded by the Obamas in their post-White House years. And it really traces this American factory, which was in the middle of the Rust Belt. Used to be a General Motors plant, I think, and it was bought over by a Chinese firm which made windshields globally. And the story really tracks some of these problems, right? So the interest of the Chinese firm to create these, to buy this plant, is that I'm closer to my customers. And that's very important because I'm making windshields which don't like to be transported very much. And there's a lot of pressure to localize production in the United States. I think I can do this much better than my competition can. So, from the American perspective, they said, great, you're going to produce here, you're going to pay tax here, you're going to create a lot of jobs here. And we get to this very, this movie is maybe a little bit center left or leftish, but it's not sort of unwatchable. And they really come up with this really quite defined challenge. And the fundamental of the challenge is that a windshield sells for X many dollars, whichever country you're in. And that means your labor input needs to be Y dollars per windshield. And you can only solve that in two ways. You can either produce lots and lots of windshields, in a given amount of time, or you can make the time cheaper, or any combination in the middle. And that really goes a lot towards some of these problems of how do we do it? And this firm grapples with the problem of expatriates. How many expatriates, and what does that do to the community? And how does the community appreciate the number of expatriates that this firm sends out? An interesting nuanced story. In the end, the plant, without giving away the story, which is really about international business and these trade-offs, arguably does a reasonable job, but you see this very complex interaction. So I think that we've got at least a couple of groups here that you should have heard. You go, so multinationals have reasons for going overseas, and you heard some of those. They have impacts on the country that they go into, and they're very definite impacts on the labor market. I've also got some notes here about multinationals and what they're responsible for in the United States in terms of a technical output. And these, I suppose, underscore some of the advantages. You know, the disadvantages are a little bit underplayed, perhaps, but some of the advantages of multinationals. We can just talk about them. So multinationals in the United States are 1% of firms. They are 19% of all people employed, but they pay 25% of all the wages. And so what this broadly says is that they are paying above average wages. You know, so this is across all groups. There is an analysis for those of you who are interested where it is actually job adjusted. They are paying better. So it's not just that they are focused in very expensive industries. So I think part A of thinking of multinationals is, by and large, salary levels are pretty good. Right? Now, these are United States multinationals, and the point was valid that if you are an Indian firm moving into the United States, that may not hold true because you're used to a much lower cost environment. But that 1% of firms also produces 74% of all the private R&D. So if you recall, we looked a little bit at this importance of tradable goods. So 74% of all the R&D is done by this 1% of multinationals. And at least part of the reason for that is that they have to compete in many markets. When you have to compete in many markets, you spend a lot of money on research and development. They also account for something like a third of all the productivity growth and something like 48% of all labor productivity growth. So the point that this is really packaging for you is multinationals tend to be scaled businesses. They tend to be exporting, and as a result, they tend to be investing quite heavily in their products. They tend to be making quite a lot of money per person, and so their wages are actually pretty good. On the cons, they are very focused on productivity gains, and so their share of the labor market is actually slightly decreasing annually. Because multinationals tend to squeeze more out of any given individual rather than employing more individuals. And that's sort of a reality of their world. They tend to be very focused in just a few industries. And you'll be able to see those industries and you can kind of imagine reasons. They dominate trade flows, and they're also obviously the largest in capital intensive areas. And that's probably self-evident. You've got to be very big to be in capital intensive industries. So here are here is multinationals. 45% of multinationals' value revenue is in these areas. So you can see here business services. You've got some R&D, manufacturing, bit of resources. There's infrastructure. Paul, I think you raised the point about building, and I just want to point out that it is a valid question. Here's a dimension of tradability. And as you can see, by and large, infrastructure sits at lower levels. And then over the top here, you've got this idea of how differentiated a product is. And so what you can see just is that, and you don't need to really take any notes on this slide, but the idea is that multinationals do very well in a small number of industries out of the thousands that are available. And they're probably most heavily involved in R&D intensive manufacturing. You can see on the right-hand panel that R&D intensive manufacturing is smaller as a percentage of the total economy than it is in multinationals where they perform quite well. And the second one, and I can't remember, I think it may have been Gio mentioned that manufacturing is heavily tradable, and it is. And as you can see, multinationals are probably overrepresented. And the third area being resources, where it's a big chunk, but it's not such a big chunk. We can kind of imagine reasons why that is, but I'd like to point out that these do tend to sit on the higher part of the tradability spectrum, right? That encourages these multinationals. It also sets up big barriers to other companies entering. But on the differentiation spectrum, it's clearly not just about flat out differentiating your product. So just because you can be Apple doesn't mean you're going to make a multinational. Okay, and now we're kind of, many of you will be very happy to know, on a bit of a home stretch. So we're going to talk about criticisms of globalization, but I'm going to ask you to discuss a few of these points because I think they cut to some of the interesting problems and maybe some of the criticisms you've heard about this. All right, so almost every economist agrees that free trade is good in the medium to long run, certainly for aggregate well-being. So there's a key word in there, and that key word is aggregate well-being. So aggregate well-being is it's a very broad concept, and Stiglitz in his criticisms of globalization really talks to these points here. So in his trade arguments, as opposed to capital, structural changes in employment are slow and very painful. And I think this is a key point, right? It's really nice for an economist to say, on aggregate, everybody is 2% better off. It's quite difficult when you close down a factory and 1,000 people go home to convince them that, don't worry, everybody else is 0.5% better off. So this is a good idea. The next thing is obviously the speed of these changes is very rapid. And so when you get FDI into your economy, or you just allow imports, the speed of change in your domestic market is very, very rapid. And those of you who run manufacturing plants or service businesses, you'll note if somebody tomorrow morning said, I can do what you do twice as well, it isn't the case of you saying, oh, well, great, okay, well, I'll just fix my business. It's a lot more complex to get your business to actually deliver at double the speed. And so what we usually do is we imagine that nobody can do it twice as well as us until somebody enters your market with a product that's much, much better and enforces that to happen. And if that weren't the case, then you would never see changes, the types of which we've seen in many of these slides. If it was easy to adapt and to compete, then there's no good reason why you wouldn't have United States still producing 38% of global output. So the reason that wealth can be spread 38 down to 23%, right, which you'd argue is probably a good thing, a bit more natural in terms of population, etc., is because when a competitor enters the market, it's not that easy for for an incumbent to defend. And this leads to what's called second-order effects that can affect slices of the economy. Macroeconomic risks affect people dramatically, and then loose financial policy finally leads to mispricing in the short run. All right, so some ideas on what causes structural changes. So the point one is structural changes. Well, this is the home stretch. Still have to be awake. What are the sorts of things that lead to structural changes?
Policy changes within the country that they're operating. So it could be something around maybe something maybe around quotas, so that they have to then restructure.
Yep, you could have some quotas. So in terms of policy changes, definitely cause structural changes.
Yep.
In employment. Any other sort of contributions to structural changes?
Demands for the goods and services themselves. So if it's like a declining sort of market, you obviously don't want to maintain the same level of cost if you're not receiving as much benefit and reward from it. And so therefore you might want to look at restructuring your firm and or organization to reduce those costs of paying wages, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think broadly structural changes is this idea that, let's say, a given economy has got, it solves a problem of how do I allocate people and capital into making businesses. And so when you get a policy change or costs under a lot of pressure, that solution looks very different. So if you were an auto parts manufacturer in southern United States when NAFTA was announced, this has caused some problems for you. And this is the structural change there is they're saying the economy has moved to more service-based jobs. And that's a big structural change. And the adjustment to that is slow. And here's a great example of how slow that can be. In somewhere around 2014, if you recall, Greece was still in the ends of its financial crisis. And the Greek unemployment amongst youth was somewhere around 25%. So 25, 1 in 4, that's huge. You go approximately, 1,000 kilometers north, not even. And, in Australian terms, 1,000 kilometers, certainly from Perth, 1,000 kilometers gets you nowhere, gets you into the desert. And you're in Germany and you've got 5% unemployment. That shouldn't be possible, right? If pure economic theory worked, when I say pure economic theory, if what they call adjustment costs or adjustments were frictionless, you should have, 5.5%, 6% everywhere, and every Greek person who doesn't have a job goes north. The point is that these things are slow. So this is not wrong, but it's certainly slow. Okay, then he talks about these second order effects. So what are these second order effects? Any examples?
Unemployment.
Sure, unemployment.
Could it be to do with technology advancements or innovation that replaces people, or changes cuts out a certain aspect of the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, many of these changes in globalization go, okay, here's a change, and that technology transfer, as we said, let's say manufacturing becomes quicker, you get all these jobs displaced, so that's when you talk about that unemployment. You get community displacement. So as a technology moves into something, if you are let's say you offered, and we can use, every country would have had some equivalent of yellow pages or white pages. If you provide that service, the technology change is rapid, and now you have problems with what do you repurpose yourself? And so when it says that it preferentially affects slices of society, your integrative roles or are usually spared, and the roles that provide kind of more repetitive work, get affected. So this is quite substantial. And so we just got 2 more macro risks. So Stiglitz talks about macro risks that affect people dramatically, and I'm just going to go through. So, one of the key things on macro risk that he's worried about is currency. Now, it's very difficult for any person to get rid of currency risk in their own life. And so this macro risk is a big issue. If you've been, if you've worked in Africa, currency risk is an enormous problem. And it is, it's been much less so in Southeast Asia, but obviously in your very small economies, it's still quite a big deal. But the point is, you can do very little as a consumer about currency problems. And what that tends to do is leave interest rates, let's say, at a level that would be considered to be too high, if optimal, because you need to have some sort of stable place. And part of your problem is that you've got inflationary pressures, which are not fully under the control of the domestic demand. So increasing interest rates doesn't necessarily reduce inflation, when your currency's just fallen, because, or it does, but the cost is enormous. And then loose financial policy leads to mispricing. And this is the sort of thing in globalization where you go, well, what we're going to do now is things are going very well. So we have low interest rates. We have a lot of foreign direct investment coming in, or portfolio capital. And what you've got is crazy pricing. And that happened in the financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis, where you had extreme property valuations, which are very difficult for people to manage when you're just living in the economy. It's great if you've got the money and you're the person investing in property, but if you're a domestic participant. So as you can see, these are much more sophisticated problems of globalization than a simple, there's some jobs moving here or there. This is kind of the fundamentals of it. All right, so Schumpeter, many of you will have heard of at least. He coined the phrase creative destruction. Joseph Schumpeter was an economist at Harvard. And, he famously wrote, "Can capitalism survive? I think not. Socialism, yes." And part of the reason is, he said, the strength of capitalism is this process of creative destruction. And so as capitalism, the way it refreshes itself, the way it delivers value to people is by destroying whole sections of the economy with innovation, with technology change. But one of the challenges that maybe hasn't been mentioned is that capitalism does tend towards monopoly if unchecked. So these happen typically at the beginning stages of an industry, but antitrust is an important guardrail. And you've heard many of the criticisms of this. Is it a good economic thing for Google to be so dominant? Is it good economically? Certainly the answer was no when it was Standard Oil some 200 or 100 years ago, because once you accumulate a lot of capital, you can do things which are not productivity enhancing and still stop your competitors. Capitalism to create intellectuals because there's some sort of abstract element. And these are all his comments, right? These are not me. And socialism is sometimes politically irresistible, particularly when capitalism doesn't work for the majority of people. So this is his perspective, and I think it really just highlights some of the challenges that globalization creates. One of the challenges of this, and you'll see, there's some strikeouts here, and these things are struck out, is that these are quite difficult things to blame mainly on globalization. So just as many, in fact, probably slightly more jobs are lost to technology change as they are to globalization. And so to try and get rid of this by blaming globalization is actually very difficult. And this is one of the sort of core problems that populists have. You can stop trading with people, but unless you're willing to stop technology, you tend to still get these structural changes. And so you've got unemployed people and less economy, which is a big issue. Technology transfer occurs at the speed that it occurs. Of course, if you put up very high barriers, you get very poor product quality domestically, and there's no reason for any of your domestic competitors to invest in any of that. But I'd argue that that's a difficult argument to carry because the social good loss is so extensive that's not too useful. And loose financial policy is clearly a problem independent of globalization. So macroeconomic risks is maybe a fundamental argument that is fairly unique to globalization. Okay, further on capital markets. So Stiglitz's criticism is really that in capital markets, you need good information and clear competition in order for capital markets to operate efficiently. But this is not the case. And there's really three good cases, three good pieces of evidence. So domestic savings drive investment much more than anything else. And this doesn't make sense because investment should simply go to the best returns. What you'll find, is that investments, the higher a country saves, the more investment there is. And there's a very strong domestic bias to investments. So you go, well, why is that a problem? Well, it tends to be pro-cyclical. And so what happens is when things are going well, you tend to get more and more capital pouring into the same economy. And this is what creates bubbles. This is what creates collapses because things are going well. Well, everybody then starts to buy a house. Everybody pours money into an economy that's doing well. And the converse happens. When things start to go badly, everybody withdraws. So we're going to just go through a currency problem in one of the future lectures, just to highlight how that works. Not particularly complicated, but the pro-cyclical nature here is really what causes these booms and busts. And obviously there's persistence of exchange rate shocks. So if your exchange rate collapses, you'll typically spend a very long time with a poor exchange rate. Other economists, Stiglitz is not the only economist in the world. You've got other luminaries like Sachs, who is quite happy with it. Milton Friedman, quite happy with it. But there is a reality that poorly educated people in the workforce, this is in the United States, have seen zero real earnings growth for something like 40 years. And so when you're looking for criticisms of what the current system struggles to deliver and why there's such a permanent argument about globalization, it's probably this bottom statement. How much of this is due to globalization is a bit more debatable, but it's very real that real income levels are probably lower today than in the 1980s if you're in the bottom quartile of the US labor market. So why do we keep talking about the US? Well, it's very difficult to compare that with a labor market like China, which has undergone such radical transformation post the 70s that it's very difficult to kind of understand. And then you've got other sort of tightly controlled economies or managed economies like the Japanese one, which don't really allow this. But where you have very low levels of regulation, you see these effects quite markedly, and this is kind of there. So let's just talk about why. My statement is that if you're in the bottom 25% of the US workforce, and you can obviously check the statement, if you're in the bottom 25 of the US workforce, you've seen no earnings growth for the last 40 years. 40 years is a long time, right? That is not a 3-year thing. That's not GFC related. That's not dot-com bubble. This is going back to the 70s. So let's talk about a couple of reasons of why that would occur.
Is it, I'm just trying to think of kind of those kind of workers working at a certain skill level, almost, I don't know, in terms of trying to keep costs down, that kind of low level workforce is kind of capped and held down. I'm trying to think about that, but is it just been that it's been strategical to keep that level of low level manufacturing work or skilled levels jobs kind of pushed down in order to keep the overheads desirable? Which sounds like, as I say, that sounds horrible that would happen over 40 years, but
it's not wrong. There's a big argument about how that fits into globalization, that it is good enough to have the threat of offshoring to keep wages low.
Yep.
So I don't need to do much more than say, look, either you take this wage or I close the factory, to convince even unionized environments that actually maybe we should just toe the line. So you're not wrong, and it's a good answer. But where you've got to fit that is the negotiation that globalization introduces is one where you've made your options much more stark for labor. You go, well, you don't like it, I go overseas. And if you are, so why does that work there, but it doesn't work with your higher skilled individuals, right? I haven't said that everybody's earnings have been there. I've said the bottom 20%. So why doesn't it happen for the middle of the range guys?
ability for them to be in control to switch, so potentially transfer company, transfer industry.
So perhaps part of their issue is that the type of work they're involved in is less subject to that pressure. So if I have a lot of people and they are involved in the basic part of manufacturing, then we discussed earlier that part of the problem is that you can transfer technologies and manufacturing quite easily, right? But we also said it might be quite difficult to transfer other sections of the business. So, you get rapid productivity convergence, it's called. So my threat is probably less credible in many ways. If I say to 1,000 people, tightening bolts in a factory, well, look, this is going overseas. They think that that's real, and it is real because there's not. If I say to the head office, look, I'm offshoring all these jobs, they go, well, that's going to be a mess because, and I think Chi Young mentioned it earlier. They go, how are you going to get your advertising done? How's anybody going to understand anything? So you're right. So let's say the threat of globalization is real, and it's different at different levels. Asking for general other reasons. What's happened? So that's globalization. Vicky, you've got some suggestions? Sanjay?
Still all processing it and putting it together. It's all very new concepts to me.
What about just power of the government, or I don't know whether that's relevant. Is there any power between the government, like specific national government towards the organization? I mean, is that a relevant fact? Yeah, it is. So a couple of things affect this in terms of, well, one, how easy is it for that to happen? But perhaps one of the things that depresses these values is anything replacing that, right? I mean, if you have got a lot of unemployed people in the area, that naturally drags down wages. And so the less buoyant your general market, the more problematic this is. And so when you're looking at this, when you want to see stagnant wages, you go to England in the coal country, right? Because you pull out industry, you leave a lot of people at a single skill level, and there's no other industry there. So where that comes into sort of trade policy is diversity of what's around. It's unlikely if you just move a couple of jobs out, that's not too big a deal. Where you do a big trade deal, a NAFTA type deal, you tend to find a lot of the same sort of industries exit at the same time. And when that happens, a lot of those jobs exit at the same time, and that means that everybody is now looking for the same next job, but you have large numbers of it. So if one factory leaves, it actually sort of makes no difference, probably good overall, right? Reallocation of, but the challenge is in these sorts of situations is when whole whacks leave. Maybe a simple sort of thing is automation, right? These jobs tend to be highly automated. So whether it's factories, whether it's creditors, clerks, jobs that are highly automated are more and more subject to technological change. And that's just become part of it. So, when the Model T Ford, which is nearly 100 years ago now, making jobs very routine was useful because it made, it absorbed a lot of labor and you just needed people to do it right. But today you would suggest that job is rapidly automated and improved. And remember, that's what multinationals tend to be very, very good at. So productivity gains are another thing. When you look at manufacturing in the United States, you've lost more jobs to productivity gains than you have to globalization, right? And finally, this idea of saturation. Once everybody has a television, once everybody has whatever good it is, you can only produce so many of them. And then every year that you improve your productivity, you need to shift those jobs out. Right? Business is better. That's why all of you are here, because you're going, hey, how do I do this 5% better next year? Whether it's growing a market or producing something faster or whatever.
And so as markets saturate, and you see this quite well in advanced economies like Japan, United States, where you spend many, many years and you go, why can't they grow? Well, you go, well, everybody's got what they want and what they, and anything that they really want, they can't have more of. So you'd say what would be lovely is everybody wants a big house. Well, that's not being made too fast. But in terms of TVs and other consumable goods, there's real saturation.
What about in the medical industry where there's so much more robotics and digital health all coming into play?
You mean what are forecasted outcomes?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that you've got some areas. One of the things is hospitality. People dealing with people tends to be, have not been too problematic in terms of job losses, because, well, the key value delivery is that you're interacting with someone. I think there's little doubt that the administrative part of health funds in whichever country and hospitals will improve. And I think all of us will take a deep sigh of relief when you don't need to fill your same name out 42 times when you go visit one. So, I mean, this is great stuff. But, any forecast has got medical management being still very, very distant because in terms of complexity and variety, that's still really, really high. It's and perhaps variety more so than complexity is the key determinant of resistance. When you're doing one thing over and over again, it can become, if you want, outsourced. The other problem is that people don't want to move. When I say the problem, so it's not a tradable good. So that's going to stick inside countries with no problem. Globalization pressures are highest with tradable goods.
Okay.
Right? Because you're not going to ship toilet paper no matter what happens. It's just not profitable to do so. So it's mainly those high value items where there's a lot of R&D. That does get shipped a lot. It's subject to high productivity gains because it's worth it to invest in them. It's subject to a lot of automation. Okay, so just a couple more. Critics argue that the gap between rich and poor has gotten wider, and obviously the benefits have not been shared equally. And supporters suggest that the actions of governments have limited some of the improvements in many countries. So the poorest nations tend to be disproportionately controlled in ways that make no sense, dictatorships, etc. So look, globalization is complex. We're going to kind of finish off on this topic, but this is why you've got such big gaps all over the world, and this is why it's such a fruitful dinner time conversation. All right, globalization leads to strong technology transfers, and we spoke about some of the reasons for that. So anybody remember that? Was probably over an hour ago. We're going to call a breakout session soon, right? So we'll give this one away. Obviously, part of that globalization is know-how. But we've got to talk about more broadly than just know-how. So some of it is supply chain effectiveness. Right? So when you globalize, when a firm enters, and this is very important for any of your firms, and when you do these case studies, when you consider why go to another country, what are the problems, is your supply chain is a very, very important part. So it's one thing to think about, well, I'm going to take a retail store and I'm going to do it somewhere else. I mean, that's actually sort of low complexity and not really what you're here for. But when you're developing a complex product, supply chain effectiveness is a definite thing that you've got to move with you if you're going to be able to deliver in a new place. Then you've obviously got processes. Again, what I said, these can be codified, and your actual technology. So globalization leads to a lot of these transfers. And if Apple sets up in your country, they will sort out the supply chain. And when they do that, everybody gets some benefit out of that, and that is critical for growth. So FDI is one of the most powerful transforming components of globalization, because the country that enters with its money, or the company that enters with its money, will solve a lot of these problems. And the other big benefit is competition. And competition drives improvements and ensures that know-how, etc., is copied rapidly throughout an economy. So if I produce cars that are 30% better, within a very short space of time, nobody will buy your car if it's still at the wrong price. And so, you know, and this is part of that, we just said it, you know, rapid technological change. So the market responds quite quickly, because why should they put up with inferior quality? And then it is up to those companies, and they, by and large, struggle. They struggle a lot for a long time. Okay, so here's an interesting sort of limit. You cannot jump too high. So we've got this, and I'm going to leave that with you just so we do one last discussion, and it's coming in just a second. So FDI is very important. You can't jump too high. That's what we're going to pause on. So we've just spoken about, there's three things. You can have your processes, which you can write down. You can have your actual equipment, which you can build and ship. And there's know-how, which is difficult to move. Manufacturing works and is a very strong component of technology transfer, because it's got lots of process, it's got lots of equipment, and relatively little know-how. It's not no know-how. We made the point about the Japanese plant in North America, but it's less than the other two components. And that means that manufacturing productivity is transportable. So productivity level of the importer rapidly of the importing country, the importer, rapidly approaches world class. So it's an excellent way to climb the ladder, absorbs lots and lots of labor, and you can be competitive on a global scale. So again, what are we talking about here? We're saying, when you think about moving your company to a foreign market, because this is our theme, right? This is our theme for 8 lectures. When you're moving, you're not going, hey, I went to this cool course at Murdoch where we spoke about, you know, funny adverts in different countries. What you're worried about is, what mix of this stuff do I need to take forward? And we're going to get more sophisticated about how we think of that. But the point that we're making is that you can move across processes pretty easily, actually. What is really slow and tricky is know-how. And when you scale that up, you make thousands of businesses take these decisions, you get what's called globalization, and you see lots of this stuff, which is good, which is bad, which sometimes good for some sections of the market, sometimes not good, but always in an explainable way, right? And so here's the cons. You've got a factor endowment race in terms of labor, costs, and location. And what that means is, if you have some factor, you end up with an industry, and whoever makes it cheapest can attract an industry, right? So that's what's called factor endowment. So when you have very cheap power, you end up with aluminium plants. Doesn't matter if you're particularly good at anything else, but you end up with that. You get a lot of competition, and the first mover advantage, it occurs rapidly, and then that advantage ceases. And finally, you get this idea of premature deindustrialization, and that's really this question about scale. So if I can move manufacturing, in particular, and I can rapidly get it to a globally competitive level wherever I put it, then what happens to countries which join after the party is that they struggle to take that over, right? Because I can scale this in my new country. And so where this leads to challenges is, if you're currently a developing economy, let's say you're Kenya, and you decide, you know what, actually I'm going to build ships because it absorbs a lot of labor, I'm going to make a massive shipyard. The competitors today are China, South Korea, Japan, you go, oh, this is a difficult journey, and that leads you to kind of not be able to make that step. And so talking about that, and this is the same question as there's a limit to how you can jump, is what's called the global value chain problem. But let's talk about what are the problems? And Greg, I'm going to ask you just to break out at the end of this question. So we're going to do this quite quickly because we're right at the end. Is why are Apple products not made in Kenya? So, I mean, Apple can do it anywhere, and it doesn't matter if it's Kenya, I could make it South Africa. But what are the kind of things that Apple is considering when it says, do I manufacture in Kenya or not? So let's do, let's say 3 minutes. Greg? And we'll see you back in just 3 minutes. All right, let's hear it.
Hello, I'm happy to. I was with Ji Young and May. We talked a little bit about whether a factor of political instability is something to consider. General infrastructures, quality of labor, or at least the perception of around labor and branding, environmental factors, and labor standards.
Cool, nice.
Right. So for my group is with Sanjay and William. So it's more or less what Paul have shared. So mainly the infrastructure, especially on the logistic portion, is not established, and the quality of labor is not there. So I guess for Apple, the main concern will be on the supply chain. They won't be able to be part of their global supply chain if their logistic portion is not established.
Yep.
Yeah, our group was pretty similar to both as well. Nick, we just felt the infrastructure wasn't there. And I'm not sure, because I haven't looked at Kenya, whether there's even, like, it's such a big organization, can they cope with something like that as a country, as big a scale?
Yep.
I'm with Leo and Peggy. So we have four points that's very similar as well. So infrastructure, that's one. Technical know-hows. In Kenya, you may not have the expertise. The political stability in Kenya, where, you know, with a high crime rate, terrorism, kidnapping, that could be another reason why Apple is not choosing Kenya. And the fourth one is the economic inequality.
Yes, these are good reasons, right? I mean, if, you know, just talking about the logistics, if any of you have been in Kenya, you know, they have the capital Nairobi is about 400 kilometers from their port, which is Mombasa. And it's a horrible, unsafe road. It's so bad, in fact, that we distributed Nissans, like the car Nissan in Kenya, and you fly them into Nairobi. You don't actually land them in the port. Just to give you a sense of how bad logistics can be, right? This is not a small thing. So these are great reasons, right? So these are the kinds of reasons why companies, and as we said, globalization simply aggregated thousands of companies' decisions. But what do we do about people? Can we get enough people there? Is the politics going to work? Is it stable enough? You know, are we going to be subject to expropriation of our assets? You know, can we invest? You know, is labor going to be able to do it? I would suggest that probably, you know, maybe a subset of something that maybe wasn't clearly mentioned, which we're going to go through just very rapidly. And so labor and standards is part of this real problem with, in the context of jumping too high. And so I agree fully that, you know, certainly the firms are going to worry about infrastructure, they're going to worry about technical know-how, which Jenny, you mentioned, you know, maybe political problems. But I just want to talk about technical know-how, quality of labor, and labor. So that was mentioned by pretty much everybody. And this is and labor itself's quality, you know, you can really work a lot with. One of the problems is if your technology level of your outsourced manufacturing is really high, and you do not have an established industry, which you all kind of pointed out, but we need to just create like a frame. So there is no semiconductor industry in Kenya, right? That we all agree, right? And what you're pointing to is the consequence. Therefore, you don't have labor. Therefore, you don't have technical skills. But when that happens, you get the implicit feeling, and you're all right, you can't go and now dump a plant to produce iPhones, which needs to be at this standard, in a place that's never produced an iPhone before. I mean, you can routinize a lot of things, but the higher up this technology scale you get, the more sophisticated your component suppliers need to be, the more sophisticated your plant's going to be. So there's a couple of things that I just want to leave you with here. You're going to invest hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in a plant to produce high-end consumer electronics. So are you comfortable when you have political risk and you have a big capital check? This is not something you do, right? Because you just say, hold on, if you could expropriate it, I'm not doing it. So if you have a cheap plant or low skill manufacturing, it's safer to do it because you can effectively exit. We'll go into a bit of market entry mechanisms later. So that's right. Infrastructure-wise, can I get my product in? Can I get it out? Is there basic? Now that's what's called a multilateral measure of a country. Do I have education? Do I have infrastructure? Do I have power? So in Kenya, not only is the port far away, but you have power irregularly. So it's actually very, very difficult.
Is it because of also the law system? Like when you're producing products in the domestic market, you need to export the product, right? So when I'm looking in Kenya, normally it only export to few countries, not many countries. Does it matter?
Yeah, so I think that it's probably that your cost of logistics is going to be high to anywhere because you have low. I mean, one of the cheapest places to get a container from is China because there's so many ships leaving every day. So it's like not a problem. Whereas if you say, hold on, I need to get a container out of Kenya, you're in difficult water, literally, right? You're near the Somalia and you've got a lot of piracy problems there. You don't export to a lot of countries. You have to have a lot of customization. And so I think what this points to is this kind of concept that kind of we taught, you can't jump too high. And this is a real issue because when the technology level is high and you don't have anything like that, what you're going to do is struggle to deploy it suddenly in the market. And that is for these reasons like, you can't buy any components. If you run short of anything there, it's over. You switch off your factory. You've got political risk, you've got logistic risk. And where this leads us to, just to finish off globalization, is that sort of thing is one of the key problems with firms today entering advanced global value chains. It is simply not possible for Kenya to put up its hand and say, send me some of that value chain that you currently have. In your pack is a video about Apple. And the reality is the United States tried to source back the Apple Mac building, assembly, and that was reversed eventually. 5 years later, it's back in China for a very similar reason. But it tells you about the absolute sophistication you can have. Now, Kenya is not the United States by any stretch of any imagination. So they really cannot get, and this is Roderick's sort of concept. And so when you have this extremes, what you have is two things. You can't get onto the ladder. You can't use your labor advantage because Apple isn't saying, can you give me 10,000 cheap people? It's going, well, what I need is a complex supply chain. I need excellent logistics. I need high quality. And so emerging economies struggle with that. They can't use their labor advantage. And you capture less of the value chain in much the same way that, Paul, you were talking about. Well, if I can outsource you, then I pay you less. If Apple did ever go to Kenya, there would be no economic value left for Kenya because Apple has to solve all these problems. And so how much money it leaves in Kenya actually tends to be quite small, not because Apple's being bad, but because Apple's saying, actually, frankly, I have to do everything here. So take the wages. So we're going to end with that and maybe just ask, say thank you to everyone. I hope you enjoyed. See you Thursday. And maybe if we could just briefly, I've got a list of people, but if you want, we can just tick off. And if everyone can just sort of give a 2-second introduction. It's customarily at the beginning, but we've got just 5 minutes. You can just say, sort of what industry you're in. Are you manufacturing? Do you do services? And what is your kind of role? Maybe if we could do a minute each and sign off.
Hi, this is May. I'm in IT logistics for healthcare, but this is my second semester. Yep.
Good to meet you.
I'm in Singapore. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, my name's Paul. I was used to saying that. I'm Paul. I'm based in Singapore. I'm actually a learning and engagement manager, so I run participation programs in the theatre industry. So I'm a trained drama teacher by trade, I suppose, and then moved into strategy and management in the arts sector in the UK and now in Singapore. Yeah.
Cool.
Hi, Monica again. I'm actually based in Perth, over the road from where you are at the moment in Leeming. local girl. But yeah, I work for a pharmaceutical company, non-traditional sales role, working with clinical networks across Australia, developing value-added programs. So this is a little bit new for me in terms of managing an international business. So you may have lots of questions from me if that's okay.
No problem.
Hi,
Will I call out? It'd be easier.
Yeah.
So, Cindy?
Yes, I'm Cindy from in semiconductor manufacturing, and I'm located in Singapore. So this will be my last unit for this course. So yeah. Looking.
You're like, woohoo!
Yeah, that's the feeling. So I'm looking forward to have a big bang over here, the last course in my unit.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Hey Nick, I'm Sanjay, in the Air Force, living in Canberra at the moment, and yeah, in operations.
Hi, Nicholas. I'm Jenny. I'm based in Singapore. I'm in the IT industry, working in a pharmaceutical company. In the IT, I look after the performance and analytics team under the infrastructure.
Cool.
Hi, my name is William. I'm based in Singapore, and I'm an SME under the marine engineering field. Yep. Thank you.
Cool. So what did you say you were?
SME.
SME.
Hi, this is Jiang. I have been in HR consulting industry for 20 years and currently looking for opportunity outside.
Ah, cool.
Hi, this is Leon, Singapore, station in Singapore. This is my last new unit as well, same as Cindy, Jiong, and Jenny, and Sanjay. I'm in the building industry. I'm supplying building materials.
Okay, cool.
Hi, Nick. This is Vicky. And I guess you know me well, so I'm not going to introduce too much. Hopefully you can guide me through for this unit, which is also my last unit, and also the capstone project. Yeah, our group sent you the research plan. Look forward to your feedback. Thanks.
Hi, Nick. I'm Peggy, and this is my last unit as well. And I'm based in Hong Kong, and I have my own business. So I study this subject for my future company development. Thanks.
Cool. What does your company do, Peggy?
Actually, I own 3 salons.
Salon, okay.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Joyce. I'm come from Macau. I'm focused on the finance side for the gambling industry and the hotel. And this is the second unit in this program.
Cool. I think that might be. I think that's everyone, right?
Mm.
Yeah, okay. Fantastic. You all have a great evening.
Yeah, actually, I have a question. You going through the globalization.
Oh, no, okay. No, just kidding. Yeah, fire away.
So, now we are looking into like sustainability, and also a lot of companies like saying getting local source instead. I mean, looking in terms of logistics point of view, they are actually trying to get in within the ecosystem, build their own ecosystem that's nearer. Then they reduce the logistic footprint, and also how do you see in this trend? I mean, you can see that more and more organization is working towards that. So do you see that is going to be deglobalized in this manner, or you still think that globalization is still going to be the trend moving forward?
I think that, you've got different industries have got different pressures to maintain globalized. So, we'll go through this, but I think the more homogeneous a product can be globally and the more scale appropriate its manufacturing, I would suggest that that pressure is going to overwhelm, the drive to localize. And so I think that your very high-end goods are going to remain traded. So high-end equipment, high-end semiconductors, because, what little I know about semiconductor manufacturing, just as an example, was SanDisk. And they have a partnership, I think it might be with Toshiba. But, they kind of, every 5 years, they've got to build a new plant because of the wafer density. And, you're talking about billions and billions of dollars, and that just won't work with a small plant. So I can't understand the economics that would allow that, whether sustainability is a consideration or not, to be localized. But there's no doubt that other things, there's consumer pressure to localize, and some of the COVID problems are simply because of the massive variety and extended supply chains. So where you've got less pressure, so things like foodstuffs, I could imagine that might be subject to good pressure, and I think useful pressure to localize. It's probably fresher, it's probably better for local farming, etc. And you don't have that same sort of drive of massive investment. The scalability of a farm, and I'm not a farmer, but I go, it doesn't feel the same as high-end semiconductors or complex machinery. So I think those ones are unlikely. Those are unlikely to change backwards. But those industries where you kind of go, they're just on the edge of globalizing, and why should they be? And it's just a little bit of exporting here and there. Particularly right now you'll see global freight rates, if any of you are actually procuring freight to export goods or import them, are very, very expensive. And so if you're a marginal producer, I think that that might remain for some time, particularly around air freight. And so where there's not great reason to globalize, and as I said, I think great reason is things like very, very scale sensitive manufacturing, high R&D component, good standardization globally. If you're not with those, you'll probably find some consumer pressure to localize. But I don't think there's much turning back of the clock, but those sorts of areas you could probably find it slows.
Thanks.
Cool, if that's it.
Yep, that's it.
Fantastic. Guys, have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you Thursday.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Great. See you.
Cheers.
Bye.